Hey, everybody.
Nice.
We don't really have a moderator, so we're just going to roll with it.
You have seniority.
Yeah, right, that's age. Thanks for everybody for coming out. That's on this. It's actually not hot as balls yet, so it's good. It's a good start in Austin. I was going to say welcome to everybody who couldn't get into the Noah Hawley and that thing.
We're missing Norman Lear talking to Phil Rosenthal right now.
I know, they put two of the heavy hitters against us, so thank you guys for showing up.
Here?
That's
There's like
so
legends at other
upsetting.
parts of the festival.
I mean,
Don't
I think
tell
we're
us
the
we were the
target
third
audience
pick.
for that.
We were the third choice, basically. But anyway, we're all here. We're no moderator. We're just gonna go for it. Hey, David. And strange, but
Does anybody want to come up here and moderate?
right now
got some
David actually
questions?
offered to moderate, and they said that I should just be a loudmouth and quasi moderate. But I figured
That's
there's
very
five of
unlike
us.
you, Tim.
They said that.
Yeah, and I said, no, make sure you send them an email, and they didn't. So now it's going to look like I'm a big mic hog. But you've met everybody here, and we're here to talk about our lives on Twitter. So, Alan, why don't you start off with something, and then we'll have tons of questions for people.
Well, I mean, I remember Dan and Rick Porter, who he was working with as Aptoid at the time, were constantly trying to get me to join Twitter, and I would say, why do I need to do that? That's a big distraction in my life, you know. What do I have to say that's only 140 characters long? And then, and then one press tour just as an experiment, I did it, and now it basically owns my life. So, thanks, Dan.
I'm sorry. Do I need to apologize for this? I can if, you know.
No, it's a huge time suck, but it's also awesome. So
I mean, like, this is the only time that you ever listen to anything I've ever said, so, you know.
God, this
Lies.
is going to be the longest group therapy session ever.
I joined Twitter before I actually became a professional critic. I joined it to promote a podcast I'd started with my wife, who's a fellow television critic who writes for the LA Times.
Where is she? Is she here today?
Mary McNamara could not be here today.
Her name is Libby.
And
She's
her
a
name
nice
is Libby.
person.
She writes for the LA Times. We're sorry she couldn't be here today. But she was like, "That's such a stupid thing. Why would you join Twitter? You should never do that." And then immediately she would commandeer my account to leave her own tweets, which she would sign Libby like she's Hillary Clinton or something. So she got into it pretty quickly.
Yeah, I actually started Twitter long before I was a writer, which was awkward because those tweets still stand, and there is a lot of swearing. Not as much swearing as I've gone back to do the call since joining the LA Times, but it has been a very interesting thing to become a professional after the advent of Twitter, because for a long time you weren't, and a long time you weren't tweeting like a professional, so that's something you want to keep in mind as you're sending all those words out onto the internet for people to find 6 years later. Trevor Noah. Yeah.
And that's at least part of why I think I might be the only person on the panel who has the two different Twitter accounts. I have my I'm babbling about TV and entertainment Twitter account.
And then I'm babbling about sports.
Exactly, because I know that most of the people who follow me on Twitter for TV and movie stuff really don't particularly care what I think about the Red Sox, USC football, or how angry I am at Donald Trump. So I make sure that that's entirely separate. Also, it keeps the people who would be angry at me for being angry at Donald Trump from being angry at me on my main Twitter account. It's all about compartmentalizing to some degree, and it's fun because it means that at any given time I have 4 different tweet decks open, and if you follow me, you'll notice that sometimes I go back and forth between them with almost schizophrenic ease, and that's probably not healthy, but it's a thing I do.
How did you decide that Gizmo would be for the one and Babe would be for the other?
They are the two sides of my personality. And I'm not going to attempt to parse that for you. I believe it's self-evident. There's Gizmo Dan and there's Pig Dan.
Shouldn't we be tweeting this out, by the way? Shouldn't we be all doing this?
Yes, we can all just sit here and tweet the entire panel ourselves.
You know, and I was just going to read from this. I'm sure you saw this, but this was the event for today. The description, it says, "The age of Twitter and intense social immediacy has granted TV lovers a peek into the nitty-gritty details of series from start to finish. Arguably the most entertaining is the live discourse, arguably, among the community of television critics that has emerged over the last decade with direct and instant engagement with their favorite writers." Was that? Okay.
None of whom could be here today.
Right. None of your fans could be here. But all of us balancing live tweeting discussions, a bounty of showrunner post-mortem interviews, Thanks for starting that and ruining our lives, Sepinwall. Biannual TCA press tours, plus the addition of fans voraciously consuming endless amounts of content. How are TV's most thoughtful? That'd be me, right? The thoughtful. Overworked.
That'd be me.
That's you. That's everybody. Underpaid, Dan. Opinionated, Todd. Loudmouth.
Hey.
Yeah, I was not going there. I was gonna go with Sepinwall on that one. Yeah, and then critics supposed to keep it in impartial balance. Listen to them, as we're doing now, discuss the joys and struggles that come up with navigating the immediate and rapid response world of social media, all while they're keeping their personal perspectives ultimately theirs. That never happens.
Would you like to read the
Webster's
Norman Lear panel as
dictionary
well?
defines panelists as.
So that's why we're here, though. So that's apparently a thing. So what is that? No one really keeps their personal lives off of Twitter that much, though, do they?
I think I know far more than I necessarily need to know about many of our colleagues, and that's part of the fun. And also, it's not like TV is a dispassionate medium. It's not like we're giving our objective opinions on anything, even though people will always try telling us, oh, you're not objective at all. Criticism is supposed to be subjective, as if that's actually a meaningful phrase when it comes to such things. So, no, I think my Twitter it taps into whatever I am in the same way my opinion about anything taps into whoever I am.
I have gotten a little less open since joining a publication that has mostly political readers, because they will take literally anything you say and twist it to be about something else entirely. So I now mostly use Twitter for dumb jokes and self-promotion, which I think is the best way to use Twitter. But I used to use it to just basically vent all of the darkness inside of me out into the world, and now I don't do that.
Someone told me that your Twitter feed is much less funny, so I think it's interesting that you said that. Like someone found your pain.
Now that I'm trying to be funny, it's not as funny. Yeah.
But it's interesting, like a lot of the writers for television that I know look at Twitter entirely as a joke delivery system, and while we all do a certain amount of goofing around, we're using it in a very different way.
Yeah, certainly it is a place where you can still have arguments about TV without people wanting to kill each other most of the time. And that's helpful. But
I've wanted to kill Tim a few times.
True.
That's all Warriors driven, though, I think, right? Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like Twitter has gradually become sort of less of a joke delivery system and more of a spoiled Game of Thrones delivery system. And and I feel like that's sort of one of the things that was in the topic that Tim just very nicely read for us.
Thank you, by the way.
Is how much of our job is spent either talking about things that not everyone has seen because we're critics and we get screeners and screener privilege and all of that, but how much is spent on talking about things that maybe 1/3 of the country has seen or half of the country has seen, or people who insist on watching things live have seen but the vast majority of the country hasn't. How are we feeling these days about how much we're spoiling on Twitter?
I feel like if you are on Twitter and Game of Thrones is on and you don't have the Game of Thrones, I always hashtag it with Game of Thrones. So if you don't have that muted, it's on you, buddy. I don't have very much sympathy for that. It's not like I'm going out and, standing outside your house and yelling at you what happened in Game of Thrones. You consciously made the choice to step into a space.
You have literally texted me and told me what happened on Game of Thrones.
This is a very different situation. But.
Well, I'm just saying, it's not like you're not that guy. I feel like.
But there's definitely an East Coast, West Coast rap battle going. No, I mean, seriously, you being on the West and Dan's on the West Coast. Well, you guys are. So only Alan.
Only Alan's
so
on
basically,
the
Alan spoils everything for us on the East Coast.
I try very hard not to. So, for instance, I very rarely live tweet things, and if I do, I try to make it something that's not really going to give away anything to someone who hasn't seen it. So on the most recent Game of Thrones episode, or maybe 2 episodes ago, when they did the Lady Mormont scene, all I tweeted was, Lady Mormont spinoff, please, which, if you're watching the episode, you can appreciate. If you're not, you have no idea what the bleep I'm talking about, and it doesn't ruin anything of the experience for you. So that's what I try to do for the benefit of my West Coast friends.
That's how you pity us, you're saying?
Yes.
Thanks for condescending to us, Alan. Thanks.
For your warm weather.
Well, we talked just a second ago about personality on Twitter, and that's very funny that Todd said, just because of Vox, you've kind of pulled it all out of there. how much of your guys' Twitter feed has personal details, and how much of it is like how because like early on when I first joined, and it sounds like I was the last one of this group to join, but everybody said that the kiss of death is just to send links because no one will give a shit because then they want to have personality and know about you. So don't just do that. Put your personality into it, which was easy for me anyway. But how much of it do you try to keep out or put in?
My wife has several hard and fast rules for my social media activity. So there will never be photos of my kids on Twitter. There will never be, details of that part of my life, although I occasionally mention things that the kids watch or things that my wife watches. But it's largely professional and largely about sort of the writing that I'm doing and occasionally stupid things where I trip and fall and break my ankle.
I think honestly there may be people in the audience that can identify with this, but I recognized even before I was at the AV Club and my follower numbers started to climb. When I hit about 500, like there started to be enough people talking back to like things I would say that I started to curtail myself naturally. And now that my follower count has gotten high enough, like there's just certain things you can't talk about without people like, I'm not trying to humble brag. Libby, other person.
No. How many followers do you have these days, Todd?
Well, it's over 36,000 now, so it's not Sepinwall, but
None of us are Sepinwall.
I don't know how to follow that.
Guess how many Twitter followers you have.
That's shameful. No, and part of the thing,
Twitter shaming.
part of why I mentioned that earlier about joining Twitter as a, nobody, and then coming into writing and then getting a career is that it is something that I have had a really hard time transitioning with at work. So you will say things and they will be like, oh, hey, maybe don't say things. And I'm like, oh, okay, I see your point. But at the same time, like, it's very difficult to use Twitter as sort of a personal promotion, personal diary, you have this brand that is, vomit all your feelings onto Twitter, and you gain a certain amount of followers that way. And then you have to try and transition that into not doing it. And it's hard.
the thing I've realized is you assume that because somebody follows you, they've read all your tweets and know exactly what you're talking about and what the context of what you're talking about is. But that's not true at all, because obviously if you've read your Twitter feed, it's just a bunch of random people. Like, I follow a lot of shepherds, so I'll just have a lot, like, I'm not even kidding about that. Like, I'll have a lot of shepherds talking about their sheep in between, like, people talking about...
That is the most Todd thing you've ever said.
It's also a lie. He follows a lot of cat shepherds, so it's just a bunch of pictures of cats tending a sheep. So, like, I don't want it to sound like he's like, yeah, I'm really into shepherding in my spare time. Like, no, he's really into cats, which is something you all know about him already.
But when the whole thing with Sleepy Hollow death happened, I'm not going to spoil who it was, but there was a big conversation on Twitter, and so I said something along the lines of like, how can actors be written out of shows without fans freaking out? And like, we had a conversation around that, and then a couple hours later, I said something else that made me sound like I was saying that anybody who was mad about a death happening on TV was like crazy. And in context, it didn't sound like that at all, but nobody was reading it in context, so like, that was a hard day for me. So,
But it's not even like, you don't even have to wait 2 hours. I will do a tweet, and then like do a series of tweets about something, and someone will respond to the third or the fourth tweet, which is 5 minutes after the original tweet, bringing up the example that's from where the whole chain started in the first place. So
yeah, exactly.
I have a hard time sometimes remembering that Twitter is this very instantaneous thing, and people are hopping on and hopping off, and they're not like meticulously following every single thing I'm saying.
I just want to clarify, there are real shepherds with sheep. Like, I do follow actual shepherds and not just cat people. I want to set that record straight.
But no, there is a certain amount of people sort of sometimes knowing very, very well your set ideology on basically everything, because if you tweet enough over the course of 6 or 7 or 8 years, there's going to be very little that people won't know. But then there are the people who come in new, and then you also get new followers who didn't follow you for those 6 years, and so they don't know if, for example, I don't know. They don't know to lecture you about, say, for example, diversity, and they don't know if you've written 55 articles about diversity, and if you tweet regularly about the need for diversity. They don't know sort of what's on your CV as things that you care about, things that are important to you, and some people do. So you have to figure that there are both the people who don't care about you whatsoever and the people who probably care about you too much.
Or they asked Dan to name his favorite Seinfeld episode.
All the time. It's that one where whatever.
Wait, what? There are people that don't care about me?
Nobody in this room.
As the least diverse
That's
member
a-
of this panel.
That's a hostile thing there. Dan's hostile. What about, well, I mean, we should give it to these people to ask questions, but the personal thing is one thing. Are there any areas that you don't get into? And do you ever find yourself, because there are certain people on Twitter, and none of them are actually on this panel, who will, I just said that, but they're actually not. Who will, you say something and then they'll step into it, and it's like not their thing. You know, have you noticed that? Somebody you'll write something and then someone will say, actually, that's not true, but there's another TV critic, and then there'll be like a little back and forth, and there'll be a little war going on.
Well,
Do you ever restrain yourself from, or worry about what you're putting out there?
I respond hostilely to things with some frequency. Because again, it's part of the brand, you know. And so similarly, again, some people don't know, that if I respond sarcastically to something that Alan says, it's not like I'm doing it out of nowhere, and it's not like this is the first time we've ever interacted in the world. Everything I say sarcastically to Alan ideally should probably be read through the filter of the fact that we have sort of a way that we interact together. And I think that all of us have ways that we interact together. So if you were to see Todd and Libby communicating on Twitter, you might be really, really at times perplexed by how they were communicating unless you happen to know Todd and Libby, even so far as paying attention to them on Twitter, in which case, that's Todd and Libby.
That's very rude and hurtful.
And see, that's how we interact. She tells me I'm rude and hurtful, and I hang my head, because probably I am.
I've written about this before, but there is a thing where, like, let's say the most innocent mistake you could make, like you make a typo, you spell a word wrong in a piece, and if you're not there to fix it, you'll get 6, 7, 8, 9, up to like 25 people telling you misspelled this word. And like just one is very helpful. One is like, oh, you're right, I should go in and fix that. I should not look like I'm subliterate. But if you get like 25 people saying it to you, you get a little hostile, even though it's a totally innocent thing they're doing. And like that is just a structural flaw of Twitter that will probably never be solved.
Now, I want to go back to something that Tim brought up before, this idea of like us screener privilege and us talking about shows we've seen that our followers have not. And I remember like it used to be just the only way for us to do that would be either on the phone or twice a year at TCA, what'd you think of this pilot, what'd you think of that pilot? And now it goes on a lot. And I occasionally get people saying like, guys, stop talking about things that we haven't seen yet. How do y'all in general feel about that, and what approaches do you take when you're discussing things that haven't even aired yet, never mind, Game of Thrones?
Well, maybe sort of spin off of that. I don't, I never, somebody asked this last night too, and I'm pretty sure it's true of you guys, but speak up if it's not. I never read anybody's review before I've actually reviewed something, because you don't want it to be poisoned in some way. So it's a little bit annoying when I see that stuff coming up on people, oh, this is really great. I mean, I've done it, so I'm not innocent, but it does get a little bit annoying. But the other part of that, of the screener privilege thing that I think is a little bit worrisome, is when I started to see, like, are people doing trial balloons about whether that would be like a positive or a negative review, and that might be a hot button issue, because that's just something that I've seen on there where people are like, oh, I saw so and so, and then if other people start doing it, I'm like, does that mean that now you'll like it if in between, before you put that tweet out, you didn't like it? That's my only worry about the early tweets.
I sometimes think that the level of Twitter discussion around these things, like there is sort of a similar structure. As somebody who works in film and TV, there is sort of a similar structure in film Twitter, but not really. And I do sometimes worry that TV Twitter helps sort of perpetuate this idea that we have a group hive mind. Right. Like there are a lot of reasons that it seems like all TV critics love the Americans, when I'm sure there are some who don't. But some of it is just like when I see a really good episode of The Americans, I say something on Twitter, and then Alan, says something to me on GChat, like, yeah, that was a really good episode. And then he tweets something. And so like that makes it a little more isolating to feel like, it makes you feel like you're the only one if you have an outsider opinion.
I just think it's all a conversation, and I probably don't tweet about things in advance when I'm ambivalent on them. I tweet about things in advance often when they're awful or often when they're fantastic, and I don't feel bad. I figure that we're part of a conversation, and I don't feel bad tweeting positively in advance to build up hype on things that I love in advance, because I know I'm going to be tweeting about loving them in advance. If I tweeted last night about loving the first 6 episodes of the new season of Survivor's Remorse, I know that's part of sort of the communication pattern that I'm in, and the tweets are there, and then the reviews another thing, and then, it's all just part of a body of thought, I think, would be what I would say.
I haven't really established a really strong pattern with screener privilege, largely because I'm mostly a TV reporter these days, so I don't have time to watch screeners, which is really depressing. But mostly, I feel weird about it because I'm one of those people who has or does get really antsy when the East Coast is spoiling me on things, and if I'm saying, oh, hey, this week's Outlander is really, really great, it's generally because I have not been as excited about a season of something, and I want people to know, oh, hey, I still like this show, or oh, hey, you have something to look forward to. But it's always generally very vague. If I'm gonna do spoiler privilege, I'm probably not gonna say what the show is, and I'm probably gonna engage in vague tweeting, just so I can register my opinion, but not necessarily poison the well for anyone. I
sometimes sit there and somebody will say, not Alan, but somebody will say, like, oh, so I watched the first 5 episodes of show X and it's amazing. And sometimes I'll sit there quietly and think, do I type right now or do I not type right now? And say, I don't think so. Because then you'll just get into a big debate about it.
You're a big dumb dummy.
Yeah, or you never want to just say, because then you're always starting a debate when you don't have to.
Yes, it's the people who tweet enthusiastically about something that you've seen and hated, and you just want to respond, really, or no, or something like that.
I found that the Kermit sipping tea is a really good response without starting a conversation about it. Just
So that's your okay.
I mean, how do you guys think that Twitter has changed our interactions with creators?
A lot. No, I think that there is sort of this. I do feel a little weird when I write a negative review of something where the person follows me on Twitter. Now, I should say that I have a lot of people who have given me great interviews, who've been good sources for me when I'm working on stories, who I have excoriated their shows. And they've contacted me via Twitter to say, yeah, you're right, this show isn't working, via DM, obviously. But yeah, it's it is definitely a situation where I feel like if I don't like an episode of, I don't know, Jane the Virgin, Jenny Snyder-Urman's going to be like, I don't know about you, VanDerWerff. Better set down your laptop.
Yeah, she's totally that type.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I found that Twitter hurts my relationship with PR people more than it hurts my relationship with creators. I will get emails like, why don't you like this season? It's so wide. And I'm like, well, I do. This is just my job. And it's especially when you're in the recap structure, it's like, oh, now you have something you love, talk about it every week, be positive or don't, but it's forcing a lot of, critique where maybe not a lot of critique is necessary.
Definitely publicists respond more often and more specifically. I mean, there are certain, heads of network publicity who I can count on calling me for 45-minute lectures when I tweet specific negative things about their shows.
You just got to not take those calls.
Sometimes I forget where the number is coming from. It's coming from inside the house. I don't know. But yeah, I find that happens more frequently. Honestly, I can't regulate myself on Twitter well enough to worry about what anyone who's following me, what association they do or don't have with shows. And every once in a while, I'll check, and someone who I know did follow me before when I said nice things about the shows has ceased to follow me subsequently when I start saying negative things, and that's just what it is.
Well, that could be completely unrelated.
I had a great Twitter roller coaster with Josh Charles, where right around the time that they did the Hitting the Fan episode of The Good Wife, where Alicia left the firm, I wrote this great column about how this is the best The Good Wife's ever been. This is a great episode coming up, and Josh Charles started following me and saying, this is great. And then a few days later, I published my recap of that episode, in which I said, look how good Josh Charles was, even though Will is not always my favorite part of the show. And Josh Charles tweeted me, "Will's not your favorite part of the show? Not cool, man," and he unfollowed me.
That's funny. That's what I had some other person on another TV critic say, I just interviewed an actor who really hates you, and I was like, well, that could be hundreds of people. And she said, can you guess who it was? This was by DM, and I put 2 names out, and she said no, and then I said, oh, Josh Charles. She's like, yeah, that's it. So he's got a thin skin. I don't know.
Next year, the TV Critics on Josh Charles panel is going to be fantastic.
That's gonna be good. His whole career retrospective.
Josh Charles and Kurt Sutter together.
I find that half the time I don't know who's following me, whether they're because I don't see them sign up, whether they're actors, or if I'm there and I do. Sometimes I'm like, oh, that's a very bad idea. You can see so-and-so has just followed you, and you're like, you already know that in 10 minutes it's going to go live on THR that you hate the show. You're like, that's a bad idea.
It's the people who suddenly start following you whose first line in their Twitter bio is, I'm a warrior for Jesus and Trump, and you're like, okay, you're not going to be following me for very long. But nice of you to drop in for a few minutes.
I did notice that recently, a lot of the new shows that come out, and it's not anything to do with the showrunners, probably it's all publicists, but they'll all sign up for you. As soon as it comes, all the new fall shows start following you, and then it's hilarious because if it's a network show, okay, that's a terrible idea.
And also, we're all still followed by the reboot of Coach. So every single one of us is still followed by that NBC Coach reboot.
Are we all followed by Taye Diggs?
Yes.
Everyone in this room is followed by Taye Diggs. Let's get some...
let's get some questions. Is there a microphone out there?
And it doesn't necessarily just have to be about Twitter, though apparently we could talk about Twitter all day long.
Yeah.
Raise your hand if you're followed by Taye Diggs. There we go.
Wow.
Yeah, look at that.
Nice.
Let's group DM this.
That's amazing.
mother.
Is there a microphone out there, or should we just have them grab? Oh, there's one right there.
Excellent.
So just put your hand up, and you can ask questions away. There's one.
One question.
Hi, thanks all for being here. So obviously with Twitter, you are more a personal brand, and Libby was talking about this earlier, but what are the pros and cons with being more or less associated with your publications than TV critics have been previously? Before it was the Washington Post critic or the Hollywood Reporter critic, and now it's you.
Well, I'll say that when I first started at THR, they soon became, now they've changed their tune, but early on they were like, oh, wow, we don't actually own that, so he can say anything he wants to say, which he apparently is doing all the time that we didn't know about. But yeah, Dan came on, and it's not Dan at THR, so it's, I think that's less and less happening. So, but you could still certainly get fired. I can get fired if it doesn't say THR in there, or I can get fired if I say something bad. So I think the threat's still there.
I've been gradually discovering that I can get fired when he says something bad. So, it's all part and parcel. No, I think I've changed my Twitter handle as I've moved from job to jobs over, 8 years. But I was definitely Zap to It Daniel, and I was Hitfix Daniel, and now I'm the Fine Print. So, I guess gradually the publication has fallen out of that. Still THR is in the first line of my Twitter bio after my love of Jesus and Donald Trump. But
I think I figured out why those followers are following you.
what can I say? But yeah, no. I think Twitter allows for individual branding, and individual branding that often sometimes runs afoul of corporate branding. And Tim and I have the advantage of being critics, so we can say more. I know that a lot of our reporting colleagues at THR, they really feel like they can't state opinions on anything because they're journalists, and again, there actually is objectivity in journalism as opposed to objectivity in criticism. So I think they have much more of a concern about what they're going to do to disgrace the Hollywood Reporter than we do, because for the most part, we're really much more disgracing ourselves than the publication we work for on a daily basis.
We have had meetings at Vox about how our Twitter can blow up in the publication's face because, again, specifically, we have real, for instance, I get a lot of tweets from people who are politically conservative who will say, I hate Vox, but I like you. which is always like nice to hear, I guess. But yeah, we've had some problems with other writers, not myself, and Twitter. And it's just, it's always one of those things where when you are at one of those places where people watch everything you do very closely, you kind of have to naturally step back, or you're going to be in trouble.
I mean, I had that experience almost pre-Twitter when I started up my blog, which was not affiliated with the Star Ledger where I was at the time, because I was frustrated with a lot of things happening at the paper, and also feeling sort of marginalized and provincial as just this guy at a Jersey paper. And so I did this blog, and it became like this thing I was doing separate from that, and I became known for that. So for me, Twitter isn't that different. I've been at Sepinwall the entire time. I'm just me, regardless of where I've been, and so it just works out that way.
And we forget sometimes how public it all is. I insulted some publication that prognosticates awards a couple of years ago and got into a fight, and that somehow became news in a couple very random media outlets, and then that reflected back on the TCA, because I'm a TCA officer, and there were headlines in Media Bistro, TCA officer something, and it was sort of vague and random and annoying, but you forget that everything is out there and people are paying attention, and people are paying attention to everything, and you can disgrace many people in your social sphere. You're not necessarily just disgracing yourself, and I think we probably all wish that it were as simple as a one-to-one. If I say something stupid, the only person held responsible for anything stupid I say is me, but there are people who are outside of me.
And I'll say also that at least at THR, they know what they're getting, right? So they know that I'm gonna. Well, also there's certain time lag. For West Coast, I think at a certain, like 10 o'clock, I know that even 9 o'clock, everybody in the East Coast is kind of not paying attention anymore. And I know Alan's going to disagree with this, but I tend not to talk about the Warriors until after 10 o'clock, because it seems like a very hometown thing. Yeah, I know you disagree, but I don't get into trouble. I haven't heard any feedback. There's been some incidents, but there's been nothing that's bad. And they just know that, like, I'm going to swear and all the time, and I'm going to talk about whatever I want to talk about. So I think they just leave it to us to not cross that line, really.
Other questions?
Hello. Okay. So Emmy season is coming up, and I was curious how your review process, do you think it affects Emmy voters?
I think it's become pretty clear over the years that the Emmy voters are not listening to me. So
Yeah.
I've actually been wrestling with this. Like, if I write a piece that's like, nominate this show, because like theoretically I could, but like I don't know that they're going to notice that at all. And like it's I don't know how productive it is, I guess, the use of my time.
It's sort of the opposite of dancing like no one's watching. I write as if I'm pretending as if someone's reading and as if it makes a difference. Thank you. But so like you have to pretend that it can matter, because otherwise you're just going to be frustrated and you're not saying anything. So you're going to be frustrated one way or the other, and either you're frustrated and you've gone on the record as having said Matthew Rhys and Kerry Russell deserve Emmy nominations and it should be their 4th or 5th Emmy nomination at this point instead of their 0th. So you can either say I'm being frustrated and I haven't put it on record that the Emmy voters are shameful if they keep ignoring these things, or you can shout into the void and pretend that there's an off chance that somebody's listening, and the worst that happens is they're not listening, and it's just another year being powerless.
I would say that normally there would be a good discussion around whether critics can actually make or break a show, or can they hurt it, can they sink it before or after. I don't know if we even can on Twitter, and we might all have different takes on it. And I don't believe in whatever power that I can kill a show, but because we are an industry publication, I definitely noticed when I moved from the Chronicle to THR that stuff, and I wrote about the industry a lot, and not everybody who's a TV critic writes about the industry, so that's partly different. But I have noticed, and this is the one thing I will say about that part of the power part being in the industry, you definitely are heard. And I have heard back from people at the Television Academy that I wrote a column saying, there's so much stuff that's broken about the Emmys. Where do you start? But expanding the categories, I did a big thing about this. You have to get these expanded. I mean, forget about, you know, snubs and fucking up all the stuff every year about who gets nominated. Like, just fix the categories. And I got a lot of people, and they did expand the number, and I got a lot of feedback from people in the Academy who said, we read it, and we talked about it, and we decided we would expand it. And that's part of the reason I wrote not too long ago about, like, this is they're in a certain, the Television Academy is in a certain point right now where they can make amends because the Golden Globes don't want to be the Emmys anymore. And I wrote a column saying, like, now is the time you need to nominate the Americans. It's not too late. This is your chance. And I think that got hurt.
I believe that the only time I've actually influenced Emmy nominations at all is the time that I cost Henry Winkler a nomination by pointing out that the episode he was nominated for did not actually air during the eligibility period. So they took it away and they gave it to William H. Macy instead. So that's literally the only time.
Nice work, Alan.
Yep.
Jeez.
Henry Winkler.
Making friends.
Henry Winkler is the nicest man in Hollywood,
Yeah,
and
I
you
know this.
kicked him in the Emmy balls.
It was an episode of Battery Park that aired on a Saturday after golf on the West Coast in June. It was not eligible.
Wow.
Tell that to Henry Winkler, Dan.
God,
Or
you're the worst,
Alan.
Alan. I had no idea about that.
I feel so uncomfortable right now.
Are there any more questions? Because I do want to discuss whether or not Tim Goodman can kill shows.
Okay, go for it.
Hi, how much do you pay attention or not pay attention to just general discussion around shows from viewers? And does it ever sway your opinion on a show or make you relook at something that perhaps you didn't like the first time around?
Sometimes. Well, here's the thing.
It's Grumpy Todd.
5 years ago, yes. Right now, I do this thing every week. That's very optimistic. It's like every other week now, where I sort of say these are the best 18 TV shows on the air right now, and I take off ones that have left the air, put ones on that are have just debuted or I'm really liking or whatever. And 5 years ago, there would have been a lot of like people yelling at me over things that I'd left off or whatever. And now, mostly the response I get is, I've never heard of some of these shows. There's just so much TV right now that viewer discussion is so diffuse that like it's very hard to like it's very hard for buzz to build up around something the way it built up around, say, Breaking Bad. And certainly critics were involved in that buzz building up. But I think about like even a few years ago when fan opinion on something like The 100 was really coming on strong, like you don't really see that anymore. It's a lot more scattered outside of everything but Steven Universe.
I would disagree. Like, I think there are a lot of
Sure.
shows that end up on my radar because of fan conversation. For instance, there's a show about, and if she's here, she's going to be so mad at me. There's a show about basketball and dance. Yes, that one, that I see a lot of chatter about online. And, like, I haven't found the time to sit and watch it yet, but, like, it piques my interest. Like, I know a little bit about it, and it's probably not for me, but I know the amount of passion it inspires in people makes me want to at least tempt the waters and be like, is this something I need to be paying more attention to? So I think Twitter especially is really great for getting these pockets of live tweeting, getting these passionate fans, getting things on at least my radar that otherwise I would have completely missed.
Now, this isn't exactly fandom, but I can point to a specific example involving two people in the back of the room, Eric Goldman and Matt Fowler from IGN. I was having a slow day a couple of months ago, which is very rare in this business because, as Todd says, there's just so much to watch. And I was just looking for something, and I saw Eric and Matt tweeting at each other about Person of Interest, which was a show I had been sort of meaning to catch up on forever and never found the time. And that day, I was like, fuck it, I will watch some Person of Interest episodes. And I DM'd them and said, where should I start? And, you know, a few months later, or a few weeks later, I was basically caught up. So it can happen, but it's really hard because there's just too many shows.
And sometimes I'll crowdsource, you know, like if I'm 8 episodes or 9 episodes behind of something on my DVR, and I'll be, okay, so does someone want to give me a reason why I want to continue to watch Blacklist? And if literally in 3 hours I get 0 people telling me that I need to go back to Blacklist, even I'm capable of figuring that out and deleting Blacklist from my DVR, though it took, trust me, a good deal more than 8 episodes. It took like 20 episodes piled up, but in any case. So sometimes I feel like that happens where enough people will say, oh, did you watch this week's ... It was fantastic, and I'll move it up in my list of things that I'm watching. I'll give it priority, and it happens.
I definitely get it both from viewers or what does Variety call it, pros and non-pros, and then same with critics. Like early on with other critics, I was behind. I'd never watched Black Mirror, but everybody wouldn't shut the fuck up about it. So at some point, I had to watch it, and it was worth it. And it's I think that's true of a lot of foreign shows that are international shows that weren't here at the beginning, and I didn't have to review. And I don't know. I feel like I'm constantly drowning in reviews. So like when you add new stuff to it, that's like the last thing I want to hear. But lately, I've been definitely like somebody was telling me I didn't review River, and somebody told me about that, and then somebody else was talking about like French cop shows, and so I've added a whole bunch of stuff. There's a woman in Italy who's talking about certain shows over there, and I make a big list and decide that I'll eventually get to them, but I haven't yet. But
Borgen has been on my list for like
Borgen.
5 years now.
One of these days I will watch Borgen. One of these days I'll watch Peaky Blinders. There are so many
yes,
things.
Peaky Blinders was one of the ones that everybody.
Rocco, Spiral,
Right.
yeah, that's a long list.
You got to watch Borgen because you don't know enough about Danish pig policy, like their hog farming policies. And once you watch
that's
it,
more of a
you
Dan
will
thing,
know
though.
everything
And
about Danish.
also, like you will find the Game of Thrones like farm team.
Yeah.
Also, yeah, and like I think it's Gomorrah was the one from the woman from
That's
Italy.
at least coming
That's
here.
coming
in a
to
few
the
months.
US.
That's
Yeah.
coming, and so she's been saying, but she was talking about that like a year and a half ago or something, and I was like, okay, I'll add it to the list.
Who else got questions?
Right up the front.
I am.
Your face lit up when I mentioned Borgen.
Thanks.
Borgen.
Are there any times when you have reviewed an episode or maybe a TV show and then like after the fact maybe rethink it or feel differently about it? I guess I'm talking about, we've mentioned that people are watching shows at different times, so they may be reading a review of yours that you wrote years prior, and I mean, did you ever have time to give thought that maybe you feel differently about a show? And then second question, nothing to do with Twitter, but since you're both together, is there any chance we're going to get something like a Firewall and Iceberg podcast ever again?
Hope always springs eternal.
We are, as you note, physically in the same location, so anything can happen.
Anything can happen. I mean, I can answer that, but we all can. I mean, we all rethink. I mean, ideally, we all rethink our things because, shows, if I'm reviewing a show off of 2 episodes and a show has gone on for 8 years and, dozens of people tell me it's great, there's a fairly strong chance that it could be a different show from the show that I watched in the first 2 episodes. And, certainly Alan and Tim do reconsiderations all the time. A couple weeks ago, I looked back at Bates Motel, which is a show that I never hated Bates Motel. I never said it was awful, but I was certainly dismissive of it at times. And the last season of Bates Motel was fantastic. And so, it's one of those things where, okay, if I have a change of opinion, yeah, I want to go out there and I want to admit that here, this is what I thought before, this is what I think now, and it was fun to like it more. Also, heaven knows we talk all the time about when a show that we love or liked got worse. So it seems only fair to go the other way as well whenever it's possible.
But even on a granular episodic kind of level, I know there are definitely times where sort of the passion of the moment overwhelms sort of my critical faculty. So like Isaac and Ishmael, the post 9/11 episode of The West Wing, I think at the time I really needed it to be good. And so like I said at the time, like, wow, this is amazing. And looking back, it's really, really not at all. And yeah.
I feel like my life is just a long journey toward accepting that I like the How I Met Your Mother finale. Like,
Get out.
right now I say I don't, but someday I'm going to wake up and be like, wow, I really like that finale. Like,
Delete your account.
No, I think the interesting thing about television is you have to accept that the episode of Two Broke Girls you're not watching right now may be the greatest episode of television in history. Like, because that's just the way the medium works. Like, any given week, it could turn into, like, a good show. It probably won't. All evidence suggests it won't. But there remains that possibility. There is some universe where Two Broke Girls that airs this week is the greatest episode of television ever produced.
I still cherish that piece you did for AV Club on the final season of Till Death and how weird that got because nobody was watching, they were able to do that.
Oh, yeah, it was so great. And the thing is, it was a thing you could only capture watching live. Because now if you go and watch on Netflix, they had stored up so many episodes of season 3, which was this regular nondescript family sitcom, and then season 4, which they just started like being this weird meta commentary on family sitcoms. So it would just vacillate wildly between like the most boring show you've ever seen and then the most boring show you've ever seen, but it keeps telling you, God, this is boring, isn't it? And like, it was so strange, and I loved it so much.
I actually did a very public mea culpa about a show. When Leslie Knope got pregnant, I was very sad because it felt like, the last stand of like the non-pregnant sitcom heroine, like Mary Tyler Moore never got pregnant. It seemed like it was a place where we were going backwards, where we couldn't have a late-term sitcom female character not eventually, let's pop up at a few kids. So I wrote something about that, like how is it that we're moving backwards with those story progressions? And then a year later, after Parks and Rec's phenomenal final season and the time jump and how they handled it so well, how the kids were completely de-emphasized, and how they went back to,
I completely forgot that Leslie Knope had kids.
No, exactly.
Dan, she had
exactly, which is
triplets.
ideal for me. That's how I prefer things. No, I went back and I said, you know what? I wrote this piece, and I wrote it on the information that I had at the time. And while I still stand by the fact that I hate that late-term sitcom females like always end up pregnant because that's apparently the demand, or because we run out of story or whatever, for whatever reason, that Parks and Rec was not a show that got hemmed into that it did something more. It didn't let it change the character. It didn't let it overtake the character, and that my original opinion had been made, without knowing the full scope.
And Parks and Rec is an interesting example of sort of the reverse phenomenon, which is we all wrote it off when it started. And then around season 2, we were like, oh, this has gotten good. And then season 3, we were like, this is one of the best shows on TV. So people out there started watching with us like season 2, season 3. And then they were like, I really like this. I want to see more Parks and Rec. So they'd go back and watch season 1. And then they'd come and say, you didn't like season 1? But because you've seen season 2 and season 3, you can read what you know about those seasons onto season 1. And that makes you a lot more favorably disposed to it. So like TV criticism in the age of streaming is really different in that way as well.
Yeah. Watching live, that first season, Leslie seems really pathetic, but you go back in the context of the later seasons, and you know how the people feel about her, and say, oh, that's all good.
Right. She's very weak sauce Michael Scott in that first season, and just felt like a gender swapped, crappy office. And until you realize what this world is, and they realize what this world is, you can go back and sort of reverse engineer.
I would just say I've done a bunch of mea culpas, and some bigger than others, but I did one on You're the Worst. But also what's great about ongoing criticism and in the Twitter age is that you can go back and say, you know what, I came out and I really liked something at the beginning, vinyl, and then... And also on Twitter, you can keep saying, hey, but you guys are forgetting when I had all these caveats about I like this, but it can't do more. Forget it. No one cares about that shit. And so they just think you're wrong. But the show sucked, and I had to come back and say, I wanted it to be something that it didn't turn out to be. And that's great that you can come back and say, this show can't be saved.
Yeah, sorry, Dan, go
No,
ahead.
you have to be able to change your mind. You have to be able to adapt. Otherwise, because the show's adapting, the shows are getting better or worse. So we have to be able to adjust to that. There was some show I panned this spring that the showrunner wrote me a very angry email about. Whatever, how dare you say this, blah, blah, blah. And I said, look, I'm going to continue to watch your show because I'm strange and OCD. And, if your show changes quality, I promise you, I will say it has changed quality. It will get out there, whether it's just me tweeting about it or not. Now, the show did not get any better, and you have not seen a mea culpa. But on the other hand, things change. And we're pretty stupid if we don't acknowledge that the show that we loved in episode, the episode 1 of the 9 might have been fantastic, and that might have been a great episode of TV, but that was not a great season of TV, so things change.
I also think that there is sort of a difference in how we watch the first couple episodes of a show, which is to say, we're looking for potential. We're looking for, are we going to follow, if we follow this thread, what's going to happen? Probably still the review I've ever written that people want to talk to me about the most is when I gave a B+ to the pilot of Two Broke Girls. To return to that particular sphere.
As it always does.
And like I saw there, I stand by that review because if you look at that pilot, there is all this stuff that has potential that it turns out they were not interested in following at all.
The last 2 minutes of that pilot is very good.
Yeah.
And I'm like, if the rest of the show is like that last 2 minutes and not like the awful 18 minutes before that, it could be good, but it was the awful 18 minutes.
Like there's a scene where Kat Dennings like accidentally kisses somebody on the subway that's like funny and she's really good in it, and I was like, okay, there is something here, but obviously they didn't do that. Most TV shows are going to become their best selves, and like usually their best self is like C, B, somewhere in that range, but most TV shows will get better just because as you do something more, you get better and better at it. It's very rare for things to get much worse. But like if you're just a viewer and you watch a pilot, you can say, that sucked, and just like tune out. And like, I think that's a difference in how we approach it.
I'm not sure I agree with that at all, that most shows become their best selves. I think...
Did you watch Dexter, Todd?
I did, well, what I'm saying is like within the first few seasons, they will become like their top level self.
I think,
like obviously if you run long enough.
I think they'll become themselves. I think they'll become what they are. I think that's very different from becoming
I'm
their
saying like
best selves.
I don't like Criminal Minds, but like I think that Criminal Minds became more Criminal Minds. So like if you're a Criminal Minds fan, like those early seasons, whatever.
But is that its best self, or is that just it? Because I think that its best self, the best self of Criminal Minds is Silence of the Lambs. There is a best self of that show that's actually a good FBI investigating serial. It has to exist because you've seen things like that in the ether that exist. That's the best version of that show. What we're getting now is the version that the writers are satisfied with letting it be. That's not, to me, anywhere near what it hypothetically could be.
Dan, don't argue with a Pollyanna. Like, legitimately. You won't win this.
This is kind of funny because it brings back to Twitter, because there are certain people on Twitter who I long ago learned not to argue with because they will never change their minds no matter what, and no good comes of it. And some of those people may be on this panel, but I'm not going to name them.
Wow.
More questions? Getting out of this.
I'm curious if there are any long-running shows, like more than 5 or 6 seasons, that you still really love, and like what those shows are.
No.
Are you talking current? Are you talking current or all time?
No, going all time's cheating.
Okay.
doesn't-
Well,
like,
The
that's
Simpsons is almost 30 years old, and I still enjoy watching The Simpsons, which I know is heresy in some corners, but it's still often very funny.
I got into a fight with people about that last night. That just because it isn't what it used to be does
You
not mean that...
always fight with people.
I do, wherever I go. I bring the fight with me, Tim. Who else?
The struggle is real.
All the time.
I think It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia is still pretty consistently good this late in its run. I think it's not at the height of its powers, but no shows are that late into their run. But yeah, I think it continues to be pretty good.
Something on the reality front like Survivor. I think Survivor's a great example of a show that sometimes becomes really stale and you think, wow, why am I still watching Survivor? And then suddenly you get a season where it was actually well cast and where the gimmick was actually legitimate and you go, oh my God, this still works. This is still great after 32 seasons. I've never seen that happen before, and I find that to be incredibly reassuring.
Let me build off of that and go with a controversial pick and say that I think that Unreal has revitalized the Bachelor and Bachelorette seasons. Now, I was never a regular viewer, but because of Unreal's creation, I can watch The Bachelor and The Bachelorette as fiction, as it was intended. And I think it's amazing. Like, I'm fascinated with it. I'm a little addicted with it. And that is a show that has a very entertaining Twitter community to key in on. That's like my sort of pop-up video, like live tweeting The Bachelorette. Like, I love it, and I think a lot of the funniest, most insightful women on Twitter are participating and excoriating that show, and I cannot get enough of it.
Other questions? One more quick one.
Back of the room, and it's the last question, so no pressure.
Hey there. Just curious, there are some people, particularly probably people that aren't obsessed enough with TV to go to a festival like this, that are a little more dismissive of critics. Like you say, oh, I read a critic and it's great. And they're like, oh, I hate critics. I always this. And I see comments on your reviews and different things where people will be like, well, who are you? What did you make? How do you get to have an opinion about this? And I've offered my defense of critics, but I would be interested in how you answer that question or if you just ignore that question when people take that route.
It's important to have critics because I need to be able to make a living.
It's important to have critics because Todd needs to make a living, and I need that.
I hate critics, so there's no.
I'm the one leaving those comments on blogs.
No, it's a job. I mean, I'd never read the comments though ever, so I never. But not that that's a bad thing because I have pretty thick skin, and there's plenty of people, real and imagined, in the industry who come up to me and say hateful things to my face. So, but yeah, I don't know. I read Todd before I even knew who Todd was, and I thought. And I've known Alan like forever, and Alan's is amazing, and he's annoying, but he's amazing, and he's also like, I just don't want any of my bosses to ever read him because the man does not stop churning out content like Dan, and I was just like, okay, not everybody can be like a machine like that, but there's also, and Matt Zoller's sites, there's like so many really great critics that I am fans of myself, and I'll read their stuff after the fact, not before, but yeah, I don't know.
I mean, I honestly think that that because I want to continue to get paid, critics are more important now than ever before, and more worthy of being paid, exorbitant salaries, ideally. Consistently with vacation time and health benefits. But I seriously do think, though, that in a universe of infinite channels, infinite digital services, everything's streaming, everything's coming from all around the world, 415 scripted shows last year, blah, blah, blah. I think more than ever before, someone has to be the first line of defense. Someone has to be willing to take the bullets on the things that are awful. Someone has to be willing to stand out and yell and say if something like Unreal is really good, and if people are going to assume that this new show on Lifetime couldn't possibly be good, someone has to stand there and say over and over and over again, this is good, and so far it's not working, but it is good. So I think it's just too hard for people who aren't as sickly obsessed as we are to, and when I say we, I mean everyone in this room as well, because if you're here, it's because you're sickly obsessed with this thing that obsesses us. There's too much, there's so much, and I think that people who are willing to be laboratory test animals, it's a valuable thing, and I think that's what we are to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you'd asked this question 4 or 5 years ago, my answer would have been more about the idea of enhancing the experience of watching the shows that you love, and we still all do that as best we can, with recaps or reviews or whatever. But I feel like the pendulum has really shifted because of what Dan is talking about. There's just so much stuff you need to filter. You need to find someone whose taste, if it doesn't exactly overlaps with yours, you understand their taste, and you can say, oh, he likes this for that reason, so I'm going to like it, or he likes this for that reason, that's not really something I care about, so I don't need to spend time on that, because how the hell else are you going to find, the thing that you're going to fall in love with?
And tying back to the theme of this, that's sort of where Twitter and sort of the enhancing of our quote-unquote brands, whatever that means, comes in, because I think more and more and more people have a sense of the wide scope of our opinions. I think it's much more clear now if you're going to agree with something Alan says, because you have a sense of what Alan thinks about almost everything, and whether that's good or bad is something else. But no, I think it's seriously much easier to choose the 5 critics who you're simpatico with, and that's all you need. You don't need 50 critics you're simpatico with, but you need Sorry, but you need, I'm saying, roughly around 5 critics that you're simpatico with.
Here.
You don't need any critics other than the people on this stage, ever. The rest of y'all can go.
I do think that Twitter's instructive because I think the idea is that we think we're coming down from on high to give like the holy word of this show is good, this show is bad, but none of us thinks that. We all know it's a conversation. We all know we're going to have different opinions. We all know you're going to have different opinions. The idea is not to define a show as good or bad. The idea is to start that discussion, and I think that criticism is the best place to do that.
Yay. That's a good way to end it. Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for coming out.